All right, we have another example here. Welcome back. We're going to be doing sine and cosine graphs again. In this graph here, we have to identify first the type of graph it is. So what I look at is where does it start on the y-axis? Notice that its starting point is the middle, not the top or the bottom. So this is going to be a sine graph because it starts at the midline. Cosines start at the max or min, and sines start at the midline. So let's get all of that information. So the equation of the midline here looks like it's going to be at -1. So we don't write -1, we write y equals -1. The maximum value, remember that's a y value. So that highest y value here is going to be 2. The minimum value is going to be your lowest y value. That's going to be -4. The amplitude is the distance between the midline and the maximum value. So we can count that. That overall distance here between the maximum value and the midline. In this case here, you're going from -2 to 2. 1, 2, 3. So your amplitude is going to be 3. And then finally, can we get our period from this? Well, because this is a sine function, remember, it's got a different approach to get that period. You don't go to the next peak. You go to where it repeats itself, just like any function. So if you trace that here, we are halfway there. Once it hits that midline again, that after the initial time, you're halfway there. So you got to keep it going. And right here is where it starts over. Not at the peak, right here. So notice that it kind of makes that S curve. Sine kind of has that general shape there. So this pi over 3 is going to be your period. Okay. Let's look at that from a Desmos point of view. So first you can write all this down here. I'm going to clear all this annotation off so we can see it on the graph. All right, so to get that equation of the graph, we can play around with it in Desmos, but let's first identify your givens, okay? Your first thing is we know it's a sine, so it's going to be y equals. And since there's going to be a number out front, because that amplitude's not 1, it's just going to have this generic, we'll put an x there, some number here, some number there, and some number at the end. Well, that first number represents your amplitude. That leading number is your amplitude, so that's going to be 3. That last number represents your midline. So you take that last number here, and it's -1. Now, I would, in the future here, let's not write plus -1. That gets a little bit too mucky when you're dealing with all the symbols. We'll just say -1. And then finally, that number inside comes from your period. But you can't just type it in there. You have to calculate it based off of 2 pi. So to get that value, which we call b, we call the first one a, b, second one b, and the third one c, we say 2 pi divided by your period is going to be equal to that b value. So it's 2 pi divided by pi over 3. Now, if you're doing this by hand, you do keep, change, flip, and you say 2 pi multiplied by 3 over pi. Those pi's cancel out. 2 times 3 is going to be 6. So that number right in there is going to be 6. You can also calculate it in your Desmos calculator or your handheld calculator. And as you can see, you still get 6. So now let's graph it. All right, I have a graph. I'm going to clear out my annotation so we can focus on what the graph looks like and compare it to what's on here on your notes. So if you'll notice here, if I zoom in, I have my midline at -1. So what I want to do is I want to write y equals -1 because I'm always basing on where the graph touches the midline here. So not here. That's where it starts. This is where it's halfway. Right there at that third point, let me uncheck these. At this point right here, that's where the graph repeats itself. Might help if I do a little bit of a cutoff here. So if you notice here, it starts itself over again at pi over 3. If you look on the graph that we drew, it does the same thing. Right here at pi over 3 at -1, it's starting over again. So that's your period. And it has a maximum of +2 right there, that y value, and it has a minimum of -4 right down there at that y value. And you can see on the graph it has those same values. So that tells you your graph is going to be what we have graphed here, 3 sine 6x minus 1. 3 sine 6x minus 1. Why don't you try the next example? Before you do that, you're going to want to just make sure that you know how to interpret that from a function written. So you'll be able to graph these and be able to get that information from a graph, whether you use Desmos or TI-84. But there is some shortcuts you can use. So one of them is, if you want to get the midline, just look at that last number. It's going to be y equals c. If there's nothing there, it's y equals 0. So y equals c is going to be your midline here. Y equals c, whatever that number is, that's your midline. Your amplitude, just get the absolute value of the number up front. I don't care if it's negative or positive. Your amplitude has to be a positive number. So if you start with a negative, amplitude's positive. If you start with a positive, amplitude's positive. It's always positive. Your maximum value is going to be your midline plus your amplitude. So you just take this number that you shift up or down, and you add, or you add your amplitude to get your maximum. But then your minimum value is going to be midline minus your amplitude. Finally, you can get your period by just taking 2 pi and dividing by that b value. That'll get you a period. So let's put it all together here, and let's take a look at the next function. You're going to want to graph this one. So make sure you're in radian mode and graph y equals -3 cosine 2x, close the parentheses, and add 7 at the end. Remember to check if you're in radian mode, click on the wrench for Desmos, and you can go down here in radians and click that. So I'm going to type in y equals -3 cos 2x plus 7. And notice that that shifted upward. And there's your graph there. Now here's a drawn out graph for us, so we can look at it a little bit closer here. So your minimum value and your maximum value are both positive in this case because we had gone up 7, so we shifted everything up a little bit. Also notice that your amplitude is bigger because of that 3 there. And your period here at that repeated part is going to be pi, not 2 pi, not pi over 3, it's just pi. So let's get all that information from here. Your midline is going to be y equals, so we always say y equals a number, so y equals 7, that's your midline, right smack dab in the middle of the maximum and minimum values. So we say y equals 7. All right, your maximum value. Now you can do this by first identifying your amplitude. So if you go to this graph here, you look at your leading number. Now drop the negative if it's negative, okay? Your amplitude is just gonna be the absolute value of that number. So it's just gonna be 3. So if you know your amplitude is 3, you can actually get your maximum value by doing your midline plus your amplitude. So it's really just going to be 7 plus 3, which is 10. So it should top off at 10. Likewise, your minimum value is going to be your midline minus your amplitude. So that's going to be 7 minus 3, and that's going to give you 4. Does that check with what we have? Hopefully. So here we go. We got this right here. We got, yeah, so our maximum value is going to be at 10. Our minimum value is at 4. And let's get our period. Our period is going to be where it repeats itself. So if you look over here, it's gonna start over again. Since it starts at the minimum value, we repeat itself here, and that's going to be at pi. Now, how can we get that from the graph? You can take this number here. This is your b value, A, B, and C. And you can take that 2, and to get the period, you just take 2 pi and divide by that b value. Well, 2 pi divided by 2 would just mean the 2's are going to cancel out. So you're left with pi. And so that's your period. Period is typed out for you. Pause the video if you need to write any of that down. All right, you do one more here, and then we'll do the last one together. All right, in this problem here, you have y equals sine 1/3 theta minus 4. Now, normally I've introduced this to you as x. So that theta just represents your angle measure, and that's what x is on these. So just treat it like an x if you want. I would shy away from trying to graph theta in your calculator. It may or may not work depending on what Desmos value you have. X will always work for every Desmos. So it means the same thing. So as far as getting the equation of the midline, see if you can do it from the equation itself. Then we'll go in the graph and see if we can pick out some of this stuff. Pause the video if you want to try it on your own. Okay, your midline is going to be y equals, and you can get the last number on this graph by saying y equals -4. Your maximum value, well, now I don't have a amplitude hanging out here. So what would it be in this case? Well, that's just 1. So your a value is going to be 1. So your amplitude is going to be 1. So I can get my maximum value by taking my midline and adding my amplitude. -4 plus 1 is -3. It'll have a highest y value of -3. My minimum value is going to be my midline minus my amplitude. -4 minus 1 is -5. Then the period, we have to look at this 1/3 here. That's your b value. We do 2 pi divided by 1/3. Now on this problem by hand, you're doing 2 pi multiplied by 3/1. That 1 doesn't need to be there because when you divide anything by 1, it doesn't change your value. But in this case here, you would multiply the 2 and the 3 to give you 6, and then there's a pi going on here. So that's actually going to be 6 pi. With your calculator, you would just do 2 divided by 1/3 and then the pi on the top. As you can see, 2 divided by 1/3 is 6, so 2 pi over 1/3 is really just 6 pi. Same numbers there, but 6 pi is what you have to put for your period because you want it as an exact answer. So here are all of your answers typed out. You can jot them all down, and I just want to remind you that you can get that 6 value just by doing 2 divided by 1/3, both in your handheld calculator or Desmos, and you'll still get 6. Just make sure you put the pi on there since the pi's don't cancel out. And also, you're welcome to graph these as well. So if you graph this, it's going to look like this. And notice that it repeats itself from the point where it hits the midline again. So at the y-axis here, it's going to start at what appears to be negative, what's the midline? -4. But then it goes up to -3, goes back down to -4, goes to its lowest point at -5, and then finally, right there at this part, at that 6 pi, your period, it's going to repeat the cycle over and over again. All right, one more example. Let's try this one. Last example. This is pretty much like the beginning examples we had where we were given a graph and we want to identify all the key features and come up with the equation. If you think you can try this on your own, pause the video. Let's go over it. So first you want to decide if it's going to be a sine or cosine. In this case here, if you notice where it starts on the y-axis, it starts at the midline. So that would be a sine. Now, the equation of the midline is just y equals, looks like that number is -5. So the c value for your equation is going to be -5. Your maximum value is going to be your highest y value. That's going to be 8. Your minimum value is going to be your lowest y value. That's going to be 2. Your amplitude is the distance between your maximum and your midline. So this distance right here is considered your amplitude. That distance is going to be 1, 2, 3. So your amplitude would be 3. Now, normally the amplitude is the A value, but we're going to talk about in a minute why that needs to be modified just a little bit, okay? So now let's look at the period. The period right here is where it starts from the y-axis and where it repeats itself. It's going to repeat itself right here at that midline, right at 4 pi. So that's going to be your period. So to get the b value, you're going to do 2 pi divided by that value, 2 pi divided by 4 pi. In this case here, the pi's just cancel out. 2 out of 4 is going to give you 0.5 or 1/2. So your b value is going to be 1/2. Now I have my c value as -5. We know it's going to be sine. And without doing any sort of investigation and trying to graph it, I would assume my a value is going to be 3. I'm going to write 3. This is 3 times sine, 3 sine. In parentheses, we're going to put our b value, 1/2. We're going to put x. Don't bother with theta unless you have to write theta for an assignment. And then at the end, we're going to do our midline. So in this case here, it's going to be, I wrote -5, but clearly I was off there. So that's +5 because that's above the x-axis. So it's going to be +5, not -5. So let's see why that would be wrong in this case. If I graph y equals +3 sine 1/2 x plus 5, it looks fairly similar to this graph here. Now, I graphed the midline here, y equals 5, just for a reference point. And you'll notice that it does hit the midline here at 4 pi. It does have a maximum value at 8. It does have a minimum value at 2. But if you notice that where the maximum minimum, it's not quite in the same spot. It's not, in this case here, it's going up first and then back down, whereas the graph that I have drawn that I have to relate it to goes down first and goes up. So in this case here, it's actually just a reflection, okay? So what you do is the amplitude's still 3, but you put a negative out front, and so you can model that downward motion, then upward first. So anytime that it's going in the reflected, always put a negative, just like any function gets a negative out front if you're reflecting it over the x-axis. So let's go ahead and modify that to a -3. And let's make that a different color so it stands out. So we're going to do -3 there. This is going to be negative. And do not forget that negative there because it's going to go reflected over the x-axis. So hopefully you learned something today. All right, hopefully you get your practice done. And if you have any questions, just ask your teacher. Thanks for watching.